I'm a sleepless friend, but you're wasting your time trying to lose the blues.
And I'm about to waste some time, the time of Tim Taylor's. Tim, I'm sorry to waste your time this afternoon. It's a lovely, lovely day here in London. Is the sun shining where you are?
It's in Norfolk. Yeah, yeah, it is. Yeah, it's pretty nice. Yesterday it was filthy, but today it's yeah, pretty sunny and clear.
Well, filthy in Norfolk sounds like the sort of a title of a rather a strange sort of paperback that perhaps we could get into that. I think I might write that book, Filthy in Norfolk.
Filthy,
Martin Robinson.
right?
It's lovely to talk to you today. We're looking at oracy, and oracy is a term that's bandied about by educationalists and politicians even, and it's something that is gaining some ground, particularly on the left. Interestingly enough, I think on the right, perhaps it's more called rhetoric and terms like that. But could you tell me what do you think of oracy as a term?
Well, yeah, not wanting to offend anybody, and because an awful lot of people that I like very much and respect who use this word, but it's not a word that I immediately want to put my arms around. It's feels a bit distancing to me, and I'm not 100% sure I know what it means beyond speaking and listening. And that obviously there'll be people who'll be slapping their forehead at this point and going, "Oh God, that's just our part of it." But it's one of those words in education that come along every now and again. I guess it's come from numeracy. That I wonder why we're using that term rather than something that's kind of plain speaking and says what it does, like speaking and listening.
Yeah, so it's certainly interesting when you type in oracy onto Google or anything like that, or Word or whatever. It gets those little red dots underneath, like a word that doesn't quite recognize itself yet. So um,
Right.
perhaps it's not in common usage, shall we say, outside the educational field. But it's about kids speaking, isn't it? Getting kids to speak, really, and I suppose to speak well in some ways. Could you could you tell me, in terms of your particular interests in Mantle of the Expert, Drama for Learning, all these things, the importance of kids being able to speak their own minds, perhaps?
Yes. So yeah, I mean, I've been rather flippant before, but oracy, yes, I think it's about the use of formal language and being able to speak well, as you say. Now, speaking well involves a number of things. Obviously, having a wide vocabulary, being able to speak clearly and in a way that will be understood. So, if we look at something like Mantle of the Expert or Drama for Learning, then I think those kinds of approaches create lots of possibilities in the classroom for that kind of development, which I think we all agree is something that we want to see. I mean, wherever you are on the educational spectrum, I think we're all of us agreed that being able to speak well and being able to use language efficiently and imaginatively and effectively is something that we'd all want children to develop in schools.
And you've already mentioned there, and I think there's two sides of drama there: drama for learning, Mantle the Expert, which perhaps comes under the umbrella of drama for learning. And there's also drama as an art form as well. So for people who don't understand the differences between those three, could you give us a little flavor of what that might be?
Well, yes, I think drama for learning is an umbrella term that involves a number of different approaches, and Mantle the Expert is an approach that uses drama and inquiry. Theatre and formal drama, academic drama, I guess, is part of a spectrum of theatre studies, I think, within education. And I mean, there is clearly an overlap, and I mean, people who use drama for learning approaches for teaching the curriculum use theatre conventions, but I think there's really quite a big difference in terms of intent between the different approaches. You're much better placed than I am, Martin, to talk about the drama and theatre side of things. That's not something I've ever taught.
Right, but so you are particularly interested in Mantle of the Expert being something from the Dorothy Heathcote school, the Dorothy Heathcote tradition, if you like, of drama teaching. Could you let's open up about that a bit?
Yeah, so Dorothy Heathcote was an academic and a teacher that taught very widely in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s up until the 2000s, and for a time was very influential after a BBC documentary about her work called Three Looms Waiting. And for a while, her work became quite widely known. Now, not to kind of go into a long history about this, but in the sort of late 70s, early 80s, Heathcote got quite frustrated because there was a feeling, a kind of a conversation going around that there was something special about Dorothy Heathcote, that people couldn't use drama for learning in the way that she was using it. And so she always sort of argued against that and said that anybody could use the things that she was doing. And so she invented something called Mantle of the Expert. Now, Mantle of the Expert is a way of using drama in the classroom. It's a way of using drama to contextualize the curriculum. Now, when we talk about drama, people imagine full-on kind of role-playing or kind of long periods of improvisation or all kinds of, or acting out stories is another kind of term that's often used. But it's really not like that. The idea about Mantle of the Expert is that there's an imaginary context, which is a narrative, an ongoing story that's often a situation that can develop into something longer term, that the teacher can use in order to contextualize the curriculum learning that they're trying to develop with their students. But that fiction can stop and start. You can step into it and you can come out of it as much as you like. And there's actually very little kind of identifiable drama, as you might call it, in a Mantle of the Expert classroom. They're stepping in, exploring it, and coming out and reflecting on it. And there's as much teaching, if not a lot more teaching, in terms of the curriculum, but it's the context that's created by Mantle of the Expert.
Right. Okay. So I'm let's say I'm getting a bit confused here. Could you give me some concrete examples, perhaps with reference to one of the pieces you've actually done with a school, about what you might mean?
So, okay. So there's a school in Norwich, an infant school in Norwich, that is studying space at the moment, and year ones. So the teachers worked out what the curriculum is for space, what the science is, learning the names of the planets, finding out about light and dark, and all the other sorts of things that are in the curriculum about space. They also want to develop the children's writing in context, so finding different reasons for writing. They want to develop speaking and listening and a whole bunch of other things. They're going to connect art, DT, and all kinds of things. Now, in a topic-based approach, which is something that was very popular in primary schools for a long time, you'd put space in the middle, and then you'd have all these kind of connected activities. Now, what Mantle of the Expert does is it creates a story context where inside the story, the children are cast in the role of people with responsibility. That's the mantle bit. The mantle bit is a metaphor for the kinds of responsibilities that experts have. So in this context that we're working on together, the students are two people who are in contact with a spaceship that's out in space beyond Jupiter. And for some reason, which they're not entirely sure about at the beginning, they've lost contact with the spaceship. Now, in their role in the fiction is to work out what's gone wrong and to reconnect with them. And NASA are the people that they work for. So in Mantle of the Expert, you have a team, you have a client, and you have a commission, which you can see those three elements are there. Now, because that story is going on, The idea is that the children get involved in that story. They get wrapped up in that story. There's attention to it. They start developing a concern for the people on the spaceship and other things that are happening. And that creates the purpose for learning the curriculum. So in order to do this work, there's a need to know the names of the planets.
Now, sorry, Tim, can I just interrupt there, because there's a lot of stuff going on here. It's play-based. Is that, I mean, is that the way into this? It's extending the child's ability and desire to play.
Yeah, absolutely. So what Dorothy Heathcote's approach is that drama, or drama for learning, I have to keep calling it that, is on the continuum of play. So play is the way that children interact with the world, and they explore the world through play. And drama for learning is an extension of that. So for the children, it feels very playful. But what the teacher's doing is now then using and applying the conventions of drama and the signs and the ways that drama operate in order to extend that play into a more meaningful and disciplined pedagogical approach.
Right. And it's interesting you said this was the example you're giving there was with an infant school.
Right.
Is it a technique that lends itself to younger years? I mean, I don't know whether it work at higher secondary or university level, but generally sort of junior school, primary school, infant school, around those years, or is it something that could be all the way through?
Well, that's a very good question, and I think it's still an open question. Now, somebody like me, who's an advocate for this approach, would say yes, this is applicable for people of all ages. But the truth is that the vast majority of the experimentation with this approach has been done in primary settings, and that's where it's been most successful. Now, we could spend quite a long time talking about why it's more successful in primary than it is in secondary, but that's the truth. The truth is that 99% of the use of this approach that I could talk to people about or point them towards is happening in primary. Now, I've used it in secondary, and there are other people who've worked in secondary that have used it. I've used it with adults and students in higher education, but not very much. And that's the truth of it.
And is this because there's a suspicion, perhaps, that it's more play than, I'm going to use the term learning advisedly, perhaps remembering or knowing stuff for the exam? The ways of expressing it. Is it something that's perhaps more open-ended rather than reaching a final conclusion about your learning?
Well, you see, there's the there's a discussion. I think the way that primaries work lends itself very much more towards exploring things in depth. So you spend a lot more time with the children, for one thing. So you can set something up like that teachers are setting up with the space, and you can return to it as much as you like during the week. And you can spend time investing in that context. And the children have that context around them all the time. Things go up on the walls. You have displays, there's artifacts that they create, there's bits of writing that they're doing. And the classroom is their place. That's where they spend all the week. In secondary settings, the context is very different. Students, and this was the thing that I found when I was, because I did some sort of experimentations in secondaries, and the big difference for me as a primary school teacher that I noticed was that you would only see the students for a short amount of time every week, and in the meantime they'd be off and doing lots of other things. So by the time they came back, you spent quite a lot of time not a huge amount of time, but a little bit of time reminding people where you were, but the last time you saw them, which might be a week ago, and you haven't got very long before they're off to do maths or PE or something else at the end of the lesson. And so that was the main. I think that is the main challenge for using something like Mantle the Expert in a secondary setting. Also, the curriculum is very different at secondary, particularly once you get into a student studying for GCSE. And one of the main questions that are asked about Mantle the Expert at secondary level is, cost benefit. Is there a benefit that is worth that cost of the time that you're going to spend setting up a context? And honestly, Martin, there hasn't been enough research, hasn't been enough experimentation in secondaries to answer that question.
Yeah, and I suppose if you did an RCT on it, then some people would be in the Mantle group and some people wouldn't be. And with all these things, it's difficult to justify it if it's people's GCSEs coming up, and using the
Right.
tried and tested tends to be the way that most parents and perhaps kids would want to go,
Yeah.
rather than bring in something a bit more experimental. I'm really interested in how a child approaches it. So, I mean, it is child-centered, I suppose, in some ways. And I'm throwing these terms out advisedly, I realize. But a child expressing themselves, going to the Oracy point of view, that they can express what they think about things, but they take on the role of a character or something.
Right. So, well, as you say, child-centered is a bit of a loaded kind of statement. It doesn't
That's why
come
I use
completely without baggage. Well, and again, this sometimes annoys people that I respect very much within the world of work that I'm in, is that I don't think it's child-centered, not in that sense. I think it's community-centered. It's about the forming of bonds. It's Mantle the Expert's about working in teams, and teams are about working together, sharing ideas, and not always having your own way. Now, of course, within a properly functioning team, within a team that works efficiently, people's voices are heard and listened to. But that doesn't always mean that you follow that person. And that's an important lesson for children. I'm really not an advocate for classrooms where there was that sort of thing, wasn't it, in the late 90s, where it was all personalized learning. I mean, I much like a lot of people teaching at that time experimented with that, and it was a nightmare. It was just a total nightmare. The amount of work that was involved, and also pretty quickly it was obvious that if you're always trying to personalize their learning, or always go from the child's interests, that you were always limited by what they knew or what they were interested in. And of course, there's conflicts within any classroom, and then you end up putting one group of people against another group of people, and it was a disaster. It was a real dead end. Whereas Mantle the Expert is much more about being collaborative. You're working together on something, and the focus is always on the commission, is on that thing that needs to be done, rather than getting your own way or being the one who's heard.
Okay, so let's say I don't know. I mean, I can't imagine myself at 8 years old, but let's pretend I am 8 years old, and I am doing the space or something about space, and I am a NASA scientist. Would I be a NASA scientist? I don't know. But there I am in the Mantle, taking on the mantle of the NASA scientist. And how do I know what that person would do? Is it the situation that's driving me as a human being who reacts, or how do I get the knowledge of what a NASA scientist would do in that situation?
Right, and here's the paradox with Mantle the Expert is, of course, they're not experts. They're
No.
not scientists. They don't really work for NASA, and just pretending that you do isn't going to teach them anything. That would just be a total waste of their time. So it's not for children that young. It isn't really. You can talk to them about scientists, but if you call them scientists and say, "Oh, you're a team of scientists," that won't mean anything to them at all. Well, one or two of them might sort of think of something that they might have seen in a film or read in a book or something, but it won't mean very much. It's the context that's important to them. The context is that there's a story going on there, where these people that are trapped out in space. Now, our job is to make contact with them. Now, what that involves and what we need to know in order to do that is my job as the teacher to teach them. The context drives the need to learn, to know. So I can stop the story at any point and using any of the normal resources that are open to me, film, book, images, my own knowledge, all those other things, to tell them. There's an awful lot of telling in Mantle the Expert. It's not a discovery approach. It's another one of these loaded words that kind of mean something, mean an awful lot in education. It's not a discovery approach. The idea is not to set them up and then they kind of find things out for themselves. When they need to know, you tell them. So you say, well, let me just tell you a little bit more about NASA. And that's outside the story. Now, of course, the people inside the story know all about NASA. They work for NASA. They've grown up knowing what NASA is. But these children might not. So you might say, now, NASA are involved in all kinds of space exploration, and sometimes things go wrong. And I just thought we might spend a little bit of time this morning talking about one or two things that have gone wrong in NASA's history and how they've coped with that. Now, you might think to yourself, well, that's a big thing for year one. But in the context, it makes perfect sense because we're involved in rescuing people that are stuck out in space. So how did NASA go about doing that? That's worth knowing. How are they going to find that out? Well, I'm going to tell them. Or we'll watch a film, or we'll read a book, or just do all the normal things.
Now, to be devil's advocate, of course,
Yeah.
You say it's worth knowing. Is this worth knowing beyond sums, reading, writing? The 3 R's: reading, writing, arithmetic.
Right. Well, that's a as you say, it's a devil's advocate question. Because it's a false equivalent, because of course all those things are important, and of course all those things are still going on in a school that's using Mantle the Expert, but they're not taught. The NASA scientists don't sit down and do spelling patterns. They're not doing their SPAG or their phonics. These kids are learning those things, but they do them discreetly. They're learning them in their SPAG lessons and in their phonics lessons and their, in their handwriting lessons. And they're doing maths lessons because they're learning number bonds to 10. They're learning, all the sorts of things that children that age need to know in their maths lessons. But they're distinct from what's going on in their Mantle lessons. So if you think about something like SPAG, so they're practicing their grammar and they're learning about probably at that age, how to start and end a sentence and learning about spelling patterns and building up their vocabulary. Well, that's the acquisition, and that will come through me as the teacher. I'm going to teach them that, and it won't look any different to any other classroom. But the application of those things finds meaning in Mantle the Expert. Because when we're writing our reports to NASA, which of course would be year one reports, not the kinds of reports that adults write, but when we're writing reports to NASA, we're writing to people that need to understand our reports. That's why we use grammar. And I'll tell that to the children. I'll say, well, that's why we start and end a sentence, because a sentence conveys meaning and you need to know where it begins and where it ends. So all this stuff we've been learning in grammar, now it's going to play an important part in what we're going to do when we're writing to NASA. Otherwise, they won't understand us.
Okay, so you see it as a partnership, perhaps, between more traditional approaches to learning and a Mantle approach to learning. It's not instead of, it's as well as.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, the traditional thing, again, is another one of them loaded words. But basically, there are some ways of learning things that work better than others. If I want to teach phonics, Mantle the Expert's a terrible way to teach phonics. But of course, children that age need to learn phonics. So the best way to teach it is in direct instruction through pattern recognition and practice and coming back and visiting things and doing things. That just works best. So why not do that for when you're teaching phonics and use Mantle for when you want to apply those skills and that developing knowledge? So that's what I would advocate. I'd advocate not thinking of one or the other, but thinking of them both.
Now, a couple of weeks ago, I think it was, Kate Green, the Shadow Secretary for Education in England, tweeted out something about, no, you tweeted out in support of an article she wrote. That's right. About, you were the tweeter, about working together in groups, the importance of that, to all the stuff that perhaps she implied the Govian curriculum had sort of torn asunder. And that is group work, it's collaborative work, it's communication, all the C's, creativity, you know, all this stuff that perhaps people have thought we've seen the end of with the Ed Balls national curriculum being torn apart by the Govian reforms. Do you want to give me a flavour of your thinking behind the tweet you put out in support of what she said?
Well, actually, what I actually said was that this was this really annoyed the traditionalists, and there was much gnashing of teeth and wailing and kind of, oh no, we're going backwards type reaction to it. My tweet was not so much in support of what she was saying in terms of thinking of it. That's the path that we have to go on. Rather, it was about, well, let's recognise that things haven't been perfect since the Govian reforms, that some things have been lost, and that we need to start having a proper grown-up conversation about the combination of these things, trivium, if you like, that we can then start saying, well, look, you know, this is not a war, that we're not at war with each other. Now, politicians come wading in, and they always do this, because they don't know what they're talking about. So she comes in and she starts saying all these kind of trigger phrases that get people annoyed and upset people and put them offside. Now I'm sure that's not her intention, but she's done that. And these are people inside education. Now, if she starts saying that education's boring and that rote learning's boring, and I can't remember all the other things she said, then that is going to upset people and annoy people, not just outside education, but inside education. And it did. And I just felt that, well, we're grown-ups. We don't have to react that way. We don't have to go, oh no, Labour want to take us all the way back to the 90s or something. I think we as a profession, we need to be a little bit more grown up with that and just say, well, look, she's a politician. She doesn't know what she's talking about. But let's admit that the Govian experiment wasn't flawless, that although things have improved in some areas, they've undoubtedly got worse in others. And let's have a proper conversation about it.
No, it's interesting. One of the big things of the pre-Govian times were things like student voice, that saw lots of children becoming parts of school councils and redesigning uniforms, basically. Perhaps slightly more seriously in some schools than others, but generally that was the kind of thing. Student voice as part of curriculum is something perhaps which is interesting here. And I'm trying to get this flavor out, instead of the one way feeding into minds, if you like, that this is what you need to know, remember it, right, put it into the exam. Mantle, the expert, Drama for Learning, tends towards a more of a two-way idea about curriculum, and that if a child wants to move slightly in this direction, you might follow. I'm trying to be subtle here without saying, obviously it's not personalized learning, it's not child-centered learning, but there is something more than just the teacher telling you this is what you need to know.
Right. And that's the point, is it's not either end of this whatever that is, continuum. That of course there is a prescribed curriculum. When the teachers were planning the Space Mantle that we were talking about, before they even went into the classroom, they had a whole list of things that they wanted the children to know by the end of it. And that's the prescribed curriculum. And that trumps everything in my view. The prescribed curriculum is what we have decided, for better or worse, as a profession, that is what we want children to learn. And that's our job, is to teach them that. And if they get to the end of the time that they're studying this and they don't know it, then we've failed. Now, that's the prescribed curriculum. But for me, there's another dimension to this, which is what might be called the emergent curriculum, which is the things that come about in the process of learning those things. So rather than thinking about, well, this is all I'm going to teach them, I'm going to teach them this, and then they're going to test to see whether they know at the end of it. You're going to say, well, in the journey, in the process of learning that, there's all kinds of other things that are going to come up. Now, Mantle, the expert, encourages that. it creates contexts in the classroom, or a culture in the classroom, if you like, where the teacher's open to other things that might develop, other ideas, other things that might come from the children. Now, that's not going to. Their job is not to let that take them off, not to divert them from the prescribed curriculum. So they've always got to be thinking, well, okay, so is that idea going to take us down the prescribed curriculum? Are we still going to be studying the prescribed curriculum, or is that going to take us off somewhere completely different? Now, I'll give you an anecdote, a tiny little anecdote. A friend of mine was, this is a long time ago, was teaching Nelson to these class of year twos, and they were studying Nelson as a famous person study, which is a kind of classic curriculum thing. And she started about 2 or 3 weeks in, and she phoned me up and she said, "Tim, the kids loving it." I said, "Oh, great." She said, "The only problem is we haven't studied anything about Nelson." And I said, "Why is that?" She said, "They're obsessed with sharks." And I said, "Well, how did you get sharks?" She said, "Well, we were in this ship, and I was talking to them about ships from that time, and I said to them, what sort of things might you be worried about?" And one of them said, "Sharks." And they all seemed to be like really interested in sharks. So I thought, oh, well, I'll teach them all about sharks. And so 2 weeks later, they'd learned loads about sharks, tons. They'd done all kinds of stuff on sharks. The kids were loving it. But it was nothing to do with Nelson. And that's the danger in this, is that if you don't keep an eye on the curriculum, by that I mean the prescribed curriculum, you can very easily get diverted. Because the children will bring their own interest in this, and if it grabs them, they'll want to do that. But that's the point of the commission and the client. That's why you have to be absolutely clear in Mantle the Expert what the commission is, because the commission is the curriculum. If you get the commission wrong, they won't be studying Nelson, they'll be studying sharks.
I like the idea of that. We want to do sharks. That's what we want to study. Yeah, I mean, you could sort of hold it back. How do you think he lost his arm? How do you think he lost his eye? Hey? Well, obviously not. But bring Jaws into it. Dun dun. I mean, there's
another there, you see, because if you ask that question, you have to be very careful about the questions you ask. Because if you ask that question, then the children are going to come up with all kinds of things. But there's a historical fact here. We're in the business of learning historical facts. So you can't ask that question. You can ask all kinds of questions about how did his family react, or what was done after his arm was chopped off, or after he was injured his arm, and you can learn all kinds of things about ship surgery and all kinds of other things. But you're in the stuff of history.
And because it's history, it's also recently become an area of controversy. Nelson being a slave owner, pulling down statues, even pulling down Nelson's column has been mooted, though I don't think taken too far. But I was talking to another person from Norfolk, no less, Patrick Alexander, who's now in charge of curriculum for Inspiration Trust, and we talked about this. Do we knock Nelson so his column goes like that, so it's no longer like that? We just knock him off his perch a bit, because of the history involved that perhaps has been covered up. Now, if the children want to go down one avenue more in a political sense about Nelson, do you follow them there, or do you guide them there now? Or is it Nelson, national hero, etc., etc.?
That's an excellent question. I think. Well, we're. See, now you caught me off guard now, because I hadn't expected this question.
No, I'm thinking, I didn't know.
How much of a question is this about Mantle, and how much is it a question about the politics of curriculum? Strictly, if I stick to the Mantle, that if you're involved in studying Nelson, as a teacher, you'll have a very clear idea about what this study is going to involve. And because it's a study of human beings, there are going to be aspects of Nelson that are going to be things that on hindsight, the look bad to us. They're the kinds of things that now we think 200 years later, that's a terrible thing that he did or that he was involved in. The danger for me in this is that if we're not careful, we can end up teaching young people about the politics of these things. Now, I'm a history graduate, and people who live in history, who are from history, they lived in their time. Now, I'm interested in an inquiry around that, and that involves the looking at the facts of it. So it's true that Nelson had slaves. That's a fact, and I wouldn't hide that from the students. Now, whether they come out of this inquiry thinking less of Nelson, or whether they think of him as a hero, or whether they think of him as a flawed hero, or whether they think of him as a villain, is their choice. That's not up to me to tell them how to view Nelson. My job is to teach them about Nelson with all his kind of flaws and all the kinds of things that he did, heroic and otherwise, and for the children to make up their own mind. Now, I'm not going to hide from that, but on the other hand, that's not. It's not going to drive every time we look at a historical figure. We're going to end up kind of judging him by our own views of the world. Is that a kind of a rather kind of weaselly answer to that, Mike? Because it's
not.
difficult ground.
Also, I'm not sure if he did own slaves himself or whether what his involvement was, but that opens up opens up what the teacher is prepared for, and obviously that if these things arise in the inquiry, then the teacher has to say, well, that's for another day, or well, let's explore that together, because the teacher's knowledge here might be lacking, perhaps. Or how far do we go from the prescribed curriculum into an area of inquiry that might mean a lot and might mean more to an inner city school, perhaps? I don't know. But how far does the teacher follow down where the kids want to go, perhaps?
Well, I think again, it's about the inquiry question. So why are we studying Nelson? You know, what is it? Now, it's not, for me, there's nothing in the curriculum that says we're studying Nelson to put him on a pedestal and call him a national hero and worship and just say he's flawless. It's saying, well, why was he famous? What did he do? You know, what was he involved in? He's a human being and he had flaws. I don't. The slave thing was news to me. I didn't know anything about that, although doesn't sound surprising. But I do know that he was unfaithful to his wife and his family. And that was something that Emma, the teacher I was talking to you about, that became a big issue with the children, with the students. They wanted to know all about it. They wanted to know. I mean, they're quite young, these kids, 6 or 7, but they wanted to know about, you know, what he was up to and why did he do that, and how did his wife feel about it, and how did his daughter feel about it, and that became a big part of it. Now, you might, or somebody might say, well, that's irrelevant. What's relevant are the dates and the things that happen in the battles and, you know, how he won them and that sort of stuff. Well, that was all important to them as well, but they were studying him as a human being, as somebody who wasn't, you know, on the one side there was Nelson the hero, Nelson the myth, Nelson the in books and legends, but behind that was Nelson the man, Nelson the person, Nelson the, you know, the philanderer and the you know, and the cad and all those other things. And, you know, for me, that's an important part of studying famous people, is that they have an image, and that image isn't always true of what's the reality of it. And you can, and that's a study that now, not to get distracted, the dates are still important, the battles are still important, you know, that's all still important. But I think it's all part of an inquiry.
So the stories we tell ourselves, and you're saying you're all about community, about how we come together. The thing about stories is stories are the way we do come together a lot of the time. And certainly if we talk about national myths, of which Nelson is but one, some of which are true, some of which are not true, some of which hide various truths from us, perhaps over time. But things like King Arthur are probably not true. Well, definitely not true at all. Where these myths that build us up are ways of binding us together in some sort of common aim, that of nation. Is it important to tell the stories that bind us together, or is it interesting as well to tell us the stories that can perhaps tear those things apart? And how do you get that balance right?
Well, yes, I think it's both are important, because I, as you say, we have stories that are about our cultural identity and about knowing those stories and sharing those stories and understanding what those stories represent and what they mean. It's interesting that you chose Arthur because, obviously those stories came out of a particular time in history that were invented at a time when then people at that time were interested in nationhood, and that our country doesn't really have a mythology. It was something that was invented by people. The author of King Arthur, but also people like Tolkien have invented a mythology in this country, and that says something. It's both a mirror and trying to think what the other metaphor would that be, but also it's something that shows us who we are, but also creates our culture. And yes, I think it's important. Is that history faultless? Should we be proud of everything that's happened in our history? Well, of course not. Should we ignore what's happened in our history? Should we pretend that the colonization of the world and the kinds of things that we did, when I say we, our forefathers did, is that something to be proud of or something to be ashamed of? Well, as a historian, I'm interested in what happened. I'm not interested in telling people, students included, how to think about that or how to feel about it. That's their choice. But I think it becomes a very dangerous profession if we start telling people, our students, how to look at history and how to look at our culture. I think that our job is to teach them about it in all its facets in the time that we have available, but not to tell them how to frame it. That's there. As human beings, that's their right.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, it's our island story versus your sort of more internationalist approach to history, perhaps, but other stories as well. But perhaps in the end, we're better off with the sharks.
Yeah, the sharks is yes, maybe. It's certainly less contentious. Let's put it that way.
Yes, swimming with sharks is easier than teaching. Teaching history in this country.
It's less could go wrong, I suppose.
Yeah, I'm interested. Tolkien has more to say about us than perhaps our own history. Whether that where that goes to, I don't know. But old Gollum would have something to say, my precious, about such things. Anyway, but Tim, it's been wonderful talking with you today about Oracy and other things. I wasn't expecting to talk about Nelson and sharks, but that's certainly part of what might come up in a mantle of the expert exercise. And I'd be fascinated to come and see some of your lessons when everything goes back to normal, which we hope will be sometime next year, perhaps.
Yeah, you'd be more than welcome. Honestly, it'd be great.
It must have affected your teaching quite a lot.
Oh yeah, enormously. Transformed my teaching.
Well, Mantle, yes. I was talking about COVID, which has also transformed your
well,
teaching.
COVID, yeah. Well, absolutely. Well, but anybody who works in freelance has been really massively affected by it. Yeah, and ongoing. It's not over yet.
It's not over yet, but hopefully,
sure
hopefully we can all have a reasonably good Christmas and a better new year.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers. Thanks.
You can run and hide, but you will find that where you go, the blues go. You